Morning, Grace. It is great to be back here with you, and I love coming to visit because I have a nice, quiet 5.5-hour drive, and that's just enough. Any more than that, I'm going to get grumpy. So that's just enough. I get some time to think, to dream, to plan a little bit, and I love being here with you because so many of you, well, you make me feel like my mission means something, and I really appreciate that, so thank you. I do want to give you a very brief update on some things that are happening with the ministry. Before the craziness descended upon us, my last speaking engagement was around March 9th. I was able to visit, I was invited to go down to this retreat conference center. The Southern Baptist Convention owns a conference center stuck into the side of a mountain in Asheville, North Carolina. It's like a Dixieland Rivendell. So those of you who are familiar with Rivendell from Lord of the Rings, it's kind of like that, and it was pretty awesome. They had 6 or 7 large events going on at the same time. It was really cool. So I got to speak at an event there, a youth event, and then drive down about an hour south to Greenville, South Carolina. I have a friend that pastors in a church down there, and he invited me to come down. And he is also a Tolkien nerd, so we had a lot of fun things to talk about. In fact, this guy has the Twitter handle J.R.R. Tolkien, and has like 450,000 followers. And he was a professor at BBC for a while, so it's weird, but these things happen. So we knew something was happening. In fact, everybody was kind of on edge. I was a little surprised that these events were still going on, but then very soon after that, everything started closing. And as you can imagine, my speaking engagements for the summer all folded up and blew away. And also, as you can imagine, someone who's going out and speaking at basically youth Christian events, they aren't all that lucrative, right? So we don't do it because we make tons of money, but we do it because it does help meet our needs within the ministry. So it is really helpful, and during the summer especially is where God usually lets us see some of that come in through speaking engagements, and I speak at some family camps, and they love the T-shirts, so all that kind of stuff. It just happens. Well, that all went away. And we were wondering, okay, what's going to happen next? How are we going to deal with this? And we were asking the question, God, are we done? Now, I don't have marketable skills beyond my degrees in theology and philosophy, and nobody really cares about that. So I'm starting to think, what am I going to do? God, are we done? And then in the end of May, a friend of mine that he went to BBC years ago. His dad was the Greek prof there for many years. He himself has a PhD in theology from the University of Toronto, and he owns his own lawn business. And I worked for him last spring. I called that my gulag experience. I did some part-time work for him, and back in May, I was over at his house borrowing a sprinkler head and stuff because I'm doing my own yard work because I survived my internship with him. And he said to me, hey, Andy, Kelly, my wife and I, we're wondering if you'd be willing to tutor our 3 oldest children. They're 8, 10, and 12. And my first thought was, what in the world do you want me to teach your children? Because they're kind of the quintessential homeschool family. The kids know way more than most kids their age, and they have the ability to talk to adults, like that kind of stuff. And they're kind of smart, and I thought, oh my word, what in the world? And he said, well, we were thinking maybe you could teach them Christian worldview through the lens of Tolkien and Lewis. Okay, stop talking. I'm in. I'm in. He said, we'll pay you. I'm like, I don't care. You already did. You've opened the door, but if you do want to write a check, that would be helpful. So he said, we'll pay you a little something, and they did, and it basically for 2 hours a week, once a week for 8 weeks. And his wife said, well, why don't we open this up to other families and see if they're interested? I thought, they're not gonna want to do this. I had my graphic arts lady. She made up a little thing for me, and I threw it up on Facebook, and we had to close it off in 4 days because what started off as 3 kids wound up with 30 kids. And I had 2 sections. I had 8 to 11-year-olds, and I had 12 to 16-year-olds. And they were reading significant literature. The little kids started off with The Hobbit. And then for 4 weeks, and then the second 4 weeks, they read Out of the Silent Planet. And I gave them discussion questions, and they came back with their answers, and we talked about the Christian worldview. The older kids, for the first 4 weeks, read Tolkien's essay on his philosophy of story called On Fairy Story. You can Google that, download it. It's about 15 pages. It's dense, though. And we talked about the value of a story and how does a story get value? Where does it come from? And then they read Out of the Silent Planet as well. And I had a blast. And the family that started this whole thing, yes, they gave us a generous honorarium. And we told the rest of the families, hey, it's free for you. This is kind of last minute. But if you would like to help, you may, because everything helps. Every week, somebody was pressing an envelope in my hands. They're handing me a check. They're handing me a wad of cash. And God took care of us. And then in June, the end of June, I got to go out to Lincoln Lake Baptist Camp. It's a sister camp of Camp Patmos, which I know you all have, some of you been there before. And they did not have camp, but they invited all of their staff, high school graduates and older, that wanted to. They could spend the summer there as a bit of an internship. And the camp had the resources to be able to do this, which is really quite amazing. And they told these young people, look, we'll feed you and house you, and then we're going to learn and grow together, work on some projects together. And part of that was a discipleship education component, and so they asked me to come out and do some teaching. So I did 18 hours of teaching in 3 days. Oh, I was exhausted. But I actually got to teach what was basically a component of my introduction to philosophy class the way I have always wanted to. And I had so much fun. We looked at some of the thinking and thoughts and thinkers that have shaped Western civilization in general and Christianity in particular without you even knowing it. Okay. But we looked at those things through the grid of Scripture for 3 days, for 6 hours a day. It was awesome. And camp was very generous with us. And I didn't expect that. I expected my travel expenses to be covered and then maybe a few $100 beyond that, but it was beyond what I expected. And then there are a couple things that happened just recently with gifts that have come in, and I didn't expect these things to happen. So all in all, God is saying, Andy, you're not done. We're not done. Now, on the home front, I did lose my office space at the University of Scranton. It's a bit of a sad story. And if you want the full details of that, I will give it to you afterward. And it just was not going to work for me to take the other office space that they are offering me. And if you want to know why, I can tell you about that afterwards. But we made the decision that I was just going to move everything home and study from my home. At some point, our old Victorian home, one of the previous owners, and there's been I think 1,006 of them. That's how old the house is. So one of the previous owners, that was a joke. No? Okay. So one of the previous owners converted the attic into a living space. So there's a large living space up there. We've used that for guests many times. There's a full bathroom up there. It was pink. That had to change. So we bought paint, and I bought good paint. And good paint is not cheap. You know that? It's like, what is this made of? It's liquid gold, apparently. But good paint is not cheap. But good paint, you get what you pay for. So we spent hundreds of dollars on paint. And I was telling Steve, we spared no expense. And I went to the ultimate source for furniture, IKEA. And I ordered some bookshelves that we needed because I didn't have it, but that cost money as well. And the end of the story is I no longer have an office. I have a study. I have a study. And do you know what I do in that study? I prepare for battle. I do. And I enjoy it. But I'm often asked, Andy, is there anything you need? Well, yes, if you'd like to help us, the gifts go right to Addison's Walk. We paid for that out of the ministry expenses. But if you would like to help us replace those, that'd be great. And we are going to land in Daniel today, but since I've been given extra time, I'm going to squander it and read extra passages. So you knew this was going to happen. But there's a couple passages that I just want to bring to your attention. And if you want to write these down, or if you're a sword drill champion, you can get there fast, be my guest. Philippians chapter 1. By the way, Philippians, you may not know, this is a very philosophical book. Over in Acts 17, although Paul did not write Acts, right? Dr. Luke did. Paul is a major player. And in Acts 17, he's got a layover in the city of Athens, and he does some intellectual battle with two groups of thinkers, Epicureans and Stoics. And without giving you the rundown on what all that means, just know this: the book of Philippians is a frontal assault on both Epicureanism and Stoicism. You don't need to know that to get anything out of Philippians, because it's deeply Christological, is it not? But knowing that for a philosophy nerd like me, that's good stuff. Philippians, written from death row in Rome. Paul got his wish. I want to take my case to the emperor. You got it, pal. Verse 27 of chapter 1. Whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. So what Paul means is that the chief end of Christianity and the way to know, for people to know who and what we are, is to be nice. Right? Wrong. Niceness is not a Christian virtue. Keep reading. Because I think we read stuff like that and say, oh yes, what that means, in order for us to be effective, we have to acquiesce. We have to accept. We have to amend. And I'm like a crossword champion, so I could go on with my A-word alliterations for quite some time, but I'm going to spare you. Basically, if we just kind of make everyone comfortable, then they're going to hear what we have to say. Since when? Keep reading. Then whether I come and see you or only hear about you in my absence, I will know that you stand firm in the one Spirit, striving together as one for the faith of the gospel. Striving. Fighting. 20-year-old movie, Gladiator. Russell Crowe's character is standing there in the Colosseum, first time, and he's trained as a warrior. He knows what to expect. There are other men with him are quaking with fear. And what does he say to them? No matter what comes out of that door, we must stand together as one. Where that came from. Interesting. Without being frightened in any way by those who oppose you. If you're not being opposed, something is not right. This is a sign to them that they will be destroyed and that you will be saved, and that by God. For it has been granted to you on behalf of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him. Since you're going through the same struggle you saw I had, and now hear that I have. And then I'm just going to reference another passage. You can read it on your own, Psalm 3. And you can read that on your own and see how that fits into this. I have a friend that calls this kind of talking appropriate gospel swagger. May I invite you to have some. This is why in my classroom I tell my students, and this is going to get me in trouble, so I'm going to keep doing it until it does. I tell my students I hate the word safe space. I hate it. Not going to happen. My classroom is not a safe space. Why? Because we're all going to talk about things that are uncomfortable. However, I do declare my classroom a sanctuary. And I tell my students, and I say this on a regular basis, I declare this space sanctuary, and you are protected. You are under the protection of the warrior monk. That's me. Because I think, because I've read my Bible, this is a fight. This is not about who's nicest wins. It's an appropriate way to think about the situation we're in. But I want you to turn with me in Daniel. That's where we're going to be if you're not there already. I love the book of Daniel. I don't know if you know this, but it's one of the 2 classic university passages in the Bible. Yes, I made that up. I took a graduate level class on sermon stretching, and I aced it. So I know how to do that. The other classic passage, and I already mentioned to you, is Acts 17. Paul at the University of Athens. He gets to give a speech in the faculty lounge. They call it the Areopagus. Well, in the book of Daniel, particularly in the first 3 chapters, we kind of learn that there's a bit of a university motif. Think about it. Think about the young people, the students that you know whose lives have been totally changed in the past 7 months, right? Extracurricular activities have gone away, or they've been changed in such a way that they're almost unrecognizable. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, as 15-year-old boys, their lives are changed because in 605 BC, the biggest, baddest, toughest dude on the planet, while he is on campaign crushing what is left of the Egyptian and Syrian coalition against him, while he's on campaign, his father dies, and a guy named Nebuchadnezzar finds out he is the biggest, baddest, toughest dude on the planet. So he stops by his vassal states like Jerusalem, lays siege to it, and takes captives with him back to Babylon. This is effective in siege warfare, and it was so all the way up until the Middle Ages. It is ancient, and it works. So these 4 boys suddenly find themselves forced to enroll at the University of Babylon. There was no such thing. I made that up. But think about it, right? I mean, read the first couple chapters. Was there a meal plan? Yep. How about ID cards? Yeah. Ashpenaz, he's the dean of students. Nebuchadnezzar, of course, he is the chancellor. And then if you get over halfway into chapter 2, you actually meet the head of campus security, Arioch. Okay, so it's a stretch. Oh, and you also know that there's a curriculum. They're in the 3-year accelerated program, and what I like to think of as the Hammurabi School of Wizardry. Also made it up. But they were studying with the enchanters, the wizards, the sorcerers. Daniel is training to be a Babylonian magus. We usually speak of them in the plural, magi. This is not the same. The magi who visited the young Christ child were Persian, but the word is the same. So Daniel is studying some very important things. And it would not surprise me if many of you in the room, you've heard talks on Daniel. In fact, I would be a little surprised if there's someone who's attended church for a while, that's part of your life. If you've never heard a talk on Daniel, I would be kind of shocked, because this is good like VBS material, right? Like the Lion's Den, you put like little kittens in a sandbox. Look, you're standing, right? So you have all of that kind of stuff. And it also would not surprise me if you have said or have had someone say to you that one of the ways to think about living your life is to dare to be a Daniel. That's not an unfair, unbiblical, or bad theology to say something like that. However, that is dangerous. Very, very dangerous. And I want you to think about, if you want to say that to a young person, perhaps going off to college, please do, but know what you're asking of them. You're not saying to them, and I hope when you go off to college that you're just so nice that everybody leaves you alone, and if you don't say anything, you can maintain this private faith in God that's never going to be attacked. Well, I have news for you. You can maintain a private faith in anything as long as you keep your mouth shut. And the amazing thing about these boys, daring to be a Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, or Azariah, those poor guys, they don't get any press when we say dare to be a Daniel. But Daniel and his buddies, the amazing thing about those guys is not that they maintained a private faith in God by keeping their mouths shut. They maintained a high-profile public witness for God in a hostile environment multiple times. Daniel himself in 2 major world empires, and you're going to meet them both today. Both of them. So when you say, or you think, I want to dare to be a Daniel, knowing you should know that you are risking everything. You may lose it all. You might. What did the boys say as they stood before Nebuchadnezzar? Daniel chapter 3. Did you not hear what is required of you? At the sound of the praise band, Giessman translation. You will bow down before me. They said, we're not bowing down before you. I'm going to throw you into the fiery furnace. Go ahead. Because the God that we serve is able to rescue us from your hand, but even if he does not, we're not going to bow. Daring. Daniel is an amazing book for lots of reasons. One of them, probably, that we would quickly arrive at is because it is full of important prophecies, yes, that affect the entire globe. Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar's vision of the great statue, the great man, right? We know that. But also in the book, and this is not a stretch, but it just takes a little bit of consideration, there's also some worldview issues in here. So fundamental questions that are not only being asked, in this case, a Judeo-Christian context, but fundamental questions that all schools of thought, religions, if you will, have to answer. And there's a few that are dealt with, like there's one, who or what is behind human history? And Daniel tells us the answer. It's Yahweh. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. He tells us that. He knows who or what is moving the pieces. And you see that theme coming up, God raising up kingdoms and deposing others. You're actually going to see that language very quickly. Another question that they deal with is this: what is really real? So if you want to take notes and you're wondering, when should I start writing? Now. So I've given you a lot of stuff I'm throwing at you, but this is where I would start. You're asking the question, what is really real? Embedded, nested under that fundamental question are issues like, how do I know the value of things? Like baseball bats. How do I know the value of a baseball bat? How do I know that is it really just a stick? Or is there something else to it? And if there's something else to it, what should I do with it? Should I hang on to it as my precious? That's a word I was hoping you were going to use. As my precious and let it control me? Or will I use it for something greater? Like buying an engagement ring, which is probably better than holding on to a stick. Right? Yeah. So when humans are asking questions of value and what is really real, we are putting that under the context of asking, where does real purpose, meaning, and value come from? And this is embedded right in the second verse of Daniel 1, verse 2. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, that is Nebuchadnezzar's hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Now, if I'm grading an essay, that sounds an awful lot like filler, because it doesn't really seem to have anything to do with what's going on. And you're telling me about the tableware because I don't see how that fits into the thesis. It would appear, Daniel, you're trying to meet the word count minimum. And it's almost like incidental. Oh, yeah. I want to tell you about the cups. But it is with these vessels, these cups, that represent the downfall of an entire nation, a major one. And to understand that, to get there, we're going to start in chapter 4. And I'm not going to read all of the verses in chapter 4 and 5. I'm going to give you a summary. You can read them on your own. Please fact check me, but for time's sake, I do want to look at the narrative as a whole instead of lifting out a piece and setting it down. Because chapter 4 and chapter 5 go together. They are contrasts and comparisons. The Bible is a wonderful book of literature. Not only is it the Word of God, but it's a beautiful piece of literature using these devices of comparing and contrasting all the time. So we're going to do that to get the whole story. So look at chapter 4. Here's what it says. King Nebuchadnezzar, to the nations and peoples of every language who live in all the earth, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. If you mark, highlight, underline in your Bibles, circle that. What God has done for me. Verse 3, how great are his signs, how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom, his dominion endures from generation to generation. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous. Who is writing this, ladies and gentlemen? Who is writing this? Not Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar. Wait. The megalomaniac of chapters 1, 2, and 3? Yep. Go back to verse 2. It is my pleasure, not my duty, not because I have to, not because I feel obligated. It is my joy to tell you. So what is he doing? He's bearing witness. Testimony, we would call it. To tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me, not to me. Oh yeah, let me tell you what's going on in my life. Let me tell you what God has done to me. And probably some of us, me included in this room, have maybe said that out loud in the past 7 months. But I will admit I've thought it. Maybe you have too. That's not what Nebuchadnezzar is saying. He's saying, for me. You know where I think Nebuchadnezzar is right now? Heaven. I could be wrong about that. I have nothing more about him after this chapter, really. But I think Nebuchadnezzar is in heaven. And if you're thinking, oh yeah, I want to talk to him, get in line, because I got some questions. Right? But I think he's going to be one of the others that has been called in, and Nebuchadnezzar is going to be one of the redeemed sitting at the supper table for the marriage supper of the Lamb. Think about that. There is no person irredeemable. None. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous. I see that and I read fat, dumb, and happy, because he has destroyed everything. He has all the power. He literally could end your life by saying a word. It's over. I had a dream that made me afraid. This is not the first time Nebuchadnezzar's had a dream. And notice it says, and I found it interesting, and I sat around and I wanted to talk about it with my advisors. No, it made me scared. As I was lying in bed, the images and visions that passed through my mind terrified me. And then he goes on to say that he commanded the sorcerers and they couldn't answer, so he calls on Daniel because he knows that Daniel can do this. I said, Belshazzar, which is Daniel's Babylonian name, chief of the magicians, I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you. Verse 9, and no mystery is too difficult for you. Here's my dream. These are the visions I had while lying in bed. I looked, and there before me stood a tree in the middle of the land. Its height was enormous. If any of you are thinking, you know what, I'm interested in doing a Bible study, but I'm not sure what to do, can I make a suggestion to you? All you need is a simple search engine in your Bible. Do a study on the tree motifs in the Bible. Are trees important? Is there a tree at the beginning? Is there a tree at the beginning? Yeah. Kind of a big deal, right? Don't eat it. Yeah. Is there a tree at the end? Are there trees in the middle? Like one being the hinge of all of human history? That didn't grow up from the ground but was stuck there in the blood-soaked ground in a garbage heap outside of Jerusalem. Trees. The tree, verse 11, grew large and strong, and its top touched the sky. It was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, and it was food for all. Under it the wild animals found shelter, and the birds lived in its branches. From it every creature was fed. In the visions I saw while lying in bed, I looked, and there before me was a holy one, a messenger coming down from heaven. He called in a loud voice, cut down the tree and trim off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it, and the birds from its branches. Let the stump and its roots bound with iron and bronze remain in the ground, and the grass of the field, let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man. Let him be given the mind of an animal till 7 times pass by for him. The decision is announced by messengers. The holy ones declare the verdict. What kind of language does that sound like to you? Legal. Like there has been a trial, and Nebuchadnezzar has been found guilty in absentia. That means in absence if you're from South Scranton. So he's not there. But there's this verdict that's come down, and the angel is declaring there's been a verdict. You are guilty. Here's what's going to happen. The Holy One declares the verdict so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes and sets over them the lowliest of people. This is the dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, had. Now, Belshazzar, tell me what it means, for none of the wise men in my kingdom can interpret it for me, but you can because of the spirit of the holy gods in you. Now, perhaps even in that lengthy passage that I just read, you heard the issues of value, purpose, reason. How do I know what's important? How do I know what is really real? Where do I place my affections on the attentions? How do I know? And Nebuchadnezzar is scared to death because the thing, he has this vision of a tree, but I think the reason he's scared is when the Holy One, the messenger, the angel comes and tells him the verdict. What does the angel not say to him? The angels say to everyone else in the Bible when they show up. Yep, fear not. And why would an angel say fear not? You know why? Because they aren't like little baby cherubs in diapers firing arrows that are shaped like hearts. Pew! No. These are the divine warriors. Read on in Daniel at the end. Daniel's praying. Tapped on the shoulder. Hey, I would have been here sooner, but I've been fighting the prince of Persia. Daniel. Yeah. Amazing. He has this dream. So Daniel then recounts the dream back to Nebuchadnezzar in the next few verses. And he explains it to him. He says, well, here's the thing. You're arrogant, Nebuchadnezzar. You think you're all that in a side of hummus here in Babylon. Sorry, it wouldn't be fries. Hummus, of course. And you just think that you're everything, and you're not. Verse 25, you will be driven away from the people. You will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like the ox and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth, and he gives them to anyone he wishes. An issue of purpose, meaning value. Do you hear it? The command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that you will be restored to your kingdom when you acknowledge that heaven rules, not when you acknowledge that you're a co-regent with the Most High God, because you are not, Nebuchadnezzar. You're nothing, and you're going to learn the hard way. But when you lift your eyes to heaven, you will be restored. Therefore, your majesty, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins. He doesn't say, maybe we could have a little attitude adjustment. Maybe you could get some counseling. Maybe you could journal your thoughts. You're in sin. Repent, your majesty. And maybe all this will be spared of you. I love that Daniel adds that. And who knows? Had Nebuchadnezzar, you know what? All right, I give it all up. That's fine. I don't want to be an animal. That doesn't sound like fun at all. Well, we wouldn't have the rest of the story. Verse 28. All this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar 12 months later, a year later. As the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he said, is not this the great Babylon I have built as a royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty? Do you hear the theme of value again? Do you hear it? Even as the words were on his lips, a voice came from heaven, this is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. What happened? He was driven from the palace. He was reduced to an animal. If you're like me and you think visually, you think in pictures. Does anybody do that? I clearly cannot be the only 8th grader in the room. Somebody else, thank you. Thank you. All right, if you're wondering what this looks like, can I make a suggestion to you? Google William Blake and his painting Nebuchadnezzar. And you'll get an idea of one artist's sanctified imagination of what this looks like. So for 7 years, he's driven from the palace, and he lives like an animal. In William Blake's painting, he has Nebuchadnezzar on all fours, and the hair on his body is almost becoming like feathers. And there's this green hue to it, like he's covered in the mildew and the mold of the earth, kind of like a sloth. It's almost like a scratch and sniff painting, right? You can almost smell it. It's visceral. Verse 34, Nebuchadnezzar picks up his pen. And at the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven. And my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. Verse 37, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right value. And all his ways are just, meaning, reason, purpose. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. That is a glorious redemption story. So what's Nebuchadnezzar's problem? Well, arrogance, right? Hubris, pride. But was Nebuchadnezzar a great ruler? Great in the sense of his power? Yeah, sure he was. So, that doesn't give him the right to be arrogant, does it? No, of course not. But he is a ruler. So what ultimately is his problem? Well, here is part one of the contrast and comparison. We'll get to part two here in just a couple minutes, because we're going to slap it into overdrive. We're going to go fast and get there. But here's Nebuchadnezzar's main problem. What he did is he took what was relative, because is he the only person that's powerful, or the only person who was ever powerful? At his peak, he was the most powerful person on the planet. That's fair, right? But is he the only one? Is he the standard? Or is he one among many? It's the latter, is it not? Right? He's not the first. He's certainly not the last. Rulers come and go. Relative. He took the relative and he made it absolute. Let me say it to you another way, and this is a word that I made up. He absolutized the relative. He brought something up to the level of absolute where it did not belong. This is something that has plagued humanity nearly since the beginning. It would not surprise me if there are many of you here this morning or watching from home that this is not your first church experience. Perhaps you grew up elsewhere. Maybe you came here from another church or something. But I just want you to think of your own short church history, and I want you to think about the loss of mission intensity, the destruction of relationships perhaps that you have had to endure, all because someone has absolutized something that belongs down here. Or, as my parents would like to say, mountains out of molehills. That doesn't mean that discussions we have internally about things are not important. Of course they are. I'm not suggesting that at all. Let us be careful. Now, contrast. And we get to the cups. They've been collecting dust in the Marduk Museum, maybe the Museum of Ishtar, I don't know. I wonder, when it says in the temple of one of his gods, I wonder if Nebuchadnezzar himself ascended the steps of the great ziggurat to Marduk, of which was their chief deity, and Nebuchadnezzar would have seen himself as the chief priest of that cult, gone into the dark bedchamber and setting those vessels down on the nightstand next to the bed for their god, because they all had them. Ew, gross, by the way. That's they didn't use them for rest, FYI. and took them in and laid them. Well, they've been in there collecting dust for 2 generations now. Because we get to chapter 5. Chapter 5 is 66 years after the events of chapter 1. If my math is correct, Daniel was about 15 when he arrived in Babylon. He is now 80. He's living in the Jewish retirement home, just off the Euphrates, right? Down Synagogue Street in the Jewish quarter of Babylon. I made all of that up. That you're like, where? I don't see that. It's because it's not there. I'm an 8th grader on the inside, and I have a sanctified imagination. I'm not afraid to use it. So that's where he is. You know what else has happened in the time since we've got here from Daniel 1? It's been nearly 50 years since the destruction of Jerusalem. Gone. Razed. The temple's destroyed. The gold melted down. That happened in 586. Daniel arrived in Babylon 605. The BC numbers descend as we move up in time. They do not ascend like the AD numbers. So 605, 586, the city is destroyed. 47 years. We are now in 539 BC. Chapter 5. King Belshazzar, not to be confused with Belteshazzar, that is Daniel's Babylonian name. This is Belshazzar. Belshazzar is Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. So we skip time. That's okay. It's not. It doesn't have to be exhaustive in telling us everything that happened, so that's okay. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet, 1,000 of his nobles, to 1,000 of his nobles, and drank wine for them. Yeah, because you know what? Babylonians can party hard. They're good at that. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his grandfather, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines, might drink for them. Bad move. So here he is. The guy's 3 sheets to the wind, right? I have an idea. Can't you just see it? I mean, what does a slurring Babylonian sound like? Again, my imagination, I'm terribly sorry, but these are the things I think about. I know. Go get the cups, because they've been collecting dust, right? Grandpa has been sitting on them forever. We're going to use them. We're going to play beer pong with the vessels, because they're just cups, right? Now think about it. At the core, are they just cups? This is not a trick question. Yes. So what's the big deal? Are they not made of simple elements? Yeah, silver and gold. Elements. So are silver and gold inherently more special than, say, carbon? Nope, because guess what you're mostly made of? Carbon. I'm literally a dirt bag. Well, a carbon bag. Right? That's what you are. From dust you were made. To dust you will return. Now, if you want to be a smarty pants, well, if you squeeze carbon hard enough, you get a diamond. Yeah, blah, 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 I know. But what is a diamond at its core? Dirt. Charcoal. So what makes these cups valuable? God said they're valuable. Ultimately, that's why they're valuable, right? Nope. You and I should never have to say and make your defense of anything that you believe or anything that you understand to have value, meaning, and purpose because God said so. God does not just declare the things that we understand and the even categories of good itself come from the very essence of who God is. Not because He simply lords it over us and He has the right to, but all these things that we understand that have value, that meaning, reason, purpose, come from His character. Not just because He says so. You understand that? That the 10 Commandments represent God's character, written down so that they can be lived out. The incarnation of Jesus Christ, His murder on a Roman cross, is demonstrating God's character. He demonstrates His love for us. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. That is an issue of character. So, when the God of the universe says, you, Israel, are set apart, sanctified for a special purpose, and you're going to have stuff, because matter matters, is going to be set aside to use and worship for me, and that's it. That's why they have value. So, they go and get them, and it gets worse. Verse 4. As they drank wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. They're bowing before the periodic table of elements and declaring it to be God. Suddenly, fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. If anything's going to sober you up really fast. Right? Now, again, in your sanctified imaginations, how do you picture that? Like the size of a human hand? Or like, blam! And does it sound like the squeak of a Sharpie on the wall? Or is the plaster and the stonework beginning to crumble as it's etched? It just turns to powder, and you can hear it just pouring down the walls. Now, Belshazzar's scared to death. What does this mean? So he's loaded, but he knows that this means something important. So he brings in the wise men. They can't answer the question. And so then the queen, or the queen mother, says, I have an idea. And again, I got to tell you this. Does anybody remember the sitcom The Nanny? Fran Drescher? I just picture her sounding like that. Now, I'm not going to do the voice for you, but that's what I think it sounded like. And she's like, hey, I know. Grandpa, he used this dude. He's in the Jewish retirement home. He could answer these questions. I think you ought to go get him. Yeah. So they send the handy van over there. You know, it's got the lowers so he can get in. They're like, go get Daniel. He's like, oh, he's coming out of the Jewish retirement home. Got the tennis balls on his walker. He's like, what? You know, he's busy doing the craft class or learning how to make dreidels that day. He's like, come on. So they put him in the van. They take him over to the palace. He comes in, and you can read this. Belshazzar offers him great rewards if he can interpret what the sign means. I'll put the royal cloak on you and give you the rings and the necklaces, and I'm going to give you all the stuff just to show you how thankful I am. And what does Daniel say in verse 17? Keep it. I don't want your stuff. Give the rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for you and tell you what it means. But did Daniel have to squint because his eyes were old, or was it so large he maybe even had to back up to take it all in? And before he gets there, he said, okay, I'm going to tell you what it means, and I'm just going to sum this up for you and read the last couple verses. He said, you know what? Your grandfather, you should know this, Belshazzar. Your grandfather was arrogant. But he was humbled before God, and he learned his lesson. He was drenched with the dew of heaven until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign, reason, meaning, purpose, value, over all kingdoms on earth, and sets them over anyone he wishes. But you, Belshazzar, his son, verse 22, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all of this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. Bad position. You had the goblets from the temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives, and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand, but you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. And then he tells them the inscription. Here's what it says: Mene, mene, tekel, parson. And he says, you have been weighed in the balances. You've been found wanting, and this night your kingdom will be taken from you. And that night, the Persians walked into the city without firing a shot because they achieved a technological marvel, an engineering marvel. Ask me later about it. I'll tell you what it is. Without firing a shot, and it was over. And the world kingdom, gone. Gone. Over cups. So, I told you there's a comparison contrast. What is Belshazzar's problem? He did not absolutize a relative. He relativized the absolute. Both are wrong. Both are dangerous. Both are destructive. Does anybody relativize the absolute today? Oh, yeah. There's a militant movement that has been sweeping, coming at us, preparing our minds by numbing us to the fact that it's real, and many are trying to get us to think that if we're just nice and acquiesce and accept and all those other alliterated words, that it's going to be okay. But it is a militant movement. When someone is born with the gender God gave them and it becomes relativized, not good. What right does any human person have to do that? Think about it. Is God sovereign over all things? All things. Famous apologist and thinker Abraham Kuyper said, "There is not one square inch of the universe over which King Jesus cannot say, 'Mine.'" That includes us. All of it. So, I think it wouldn't take much for me to get you to agree with me that these are dangerous ways to operate, right? One lesson was learned, the other ended in death for Belshazzar that night. So how do we avoid that? Right? How do we know what a good kingdom looks like? What do we say? What is our standard? So we look at Nebuchadnezzar, we look at Belshazzar, we look later on at Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, the Persians. How do we know? How do we know that we're just not relativizing everything? Well, do we compare them to a contemporary 21st century North American democratic republic? Well, as a means of political philosophy, sure, there's nothing wrong with that. But ultimately, what is our standard? Because we as children of the King know there is a coming kingdom. That is the standard. So, that is how we avoid absolutizing the relative. And how do we avoid relativizing the absolute? Because we do not look at the kingdom and interpret it in ways that feel comfortable to us. We look at it and we say, God, what do you want me to know about your kingdom? How have you revealed it to us? And has he? Yes. How? Nature, Israel, the written word, and the living word. Unlike the Greek, Roman, Mesopotamian, Babylonian, Persian, Egyptian, Assyrian gods, who the people followed them and had no idea what they wanted because they did not tell them, we're told. Every which way from Tuesday. Value. You ever stop and think about how there's even categories of good and evil at all? If there is no God, where do they come from? The periodic table of elements? Nope. Biology, physics, or chemistry? Nope. In fact, you can have experimentation, but you would never have an explanation. What does it all mean? Daniel and his friends understood that there is an objective reality. We would call it an absolute. And a deviation from it, either way that I've told you, raising something up or tearing something down that are never intended to, is a destructive path. That is why their very lives were considered forfeit, because what is greater and absolute than their own lives? The name of Yahweh. That's why they ate the salad in the first chapter. That is why The teenage boys to fight an empire. That is why, as an 80-year-old coming out of retirement, and by the way, he's not done. Daniel, there's more. All had a high-profile public witness for God in a hostile environment. All. May we ask God for the wisdom, know the difference, the discernment to see, to pray what we read in the book of Ephesians. May the eyes of our hearts be opened. Are any of you lacking wisdom? Ask God. Father, I pray that this church and others like her would indeed be that city on a hill. But God, help us to be distinct, not just because we're nice. Anybody can be nice. But because, God, we chase hard after truth, and we want to value the things you value. We want to avoid the things you avoid, and disdain the things you disdain. But God, the enemy has worked hard at confusing us, and it has worked. Oh God, bring us back to an arrangement from derangement. Help us to know. We love you. In Jesus' name, amen.